The lecture this week is going to look at two different leading thinkers' approaches to what it means to be a missional church. And this one is all about Roxburgh's approach. I'd like to begin by reading this quote from United Methodist Bishop Grant Hagia. Leadership is letting people down at a rate they can tolerate. That's not necessarily directly tied to Roxburgh's model of being missional church, but I do think it's a pithy way of describing what leadership, the challenge of leadership. So, what is your understanding of missional? It is a very common term today. It's almost been overused. I mean, if everything is missional, then most of it isn't. And, what are the roots of the term? And based on what you believe is the correct meaning, are most churches naturally missional? Why do you think that, or why do you not think that? And do you know of any examples of Asian and Asian American churches that you feel are definitely missional? Well, let's get into the definition. We are invited to embrace a fundamentally different reality where God is remaking the world, and we are called to participate in that remaking. So this is Roxburgh talking about the centrality, the fundamental nature of the Missio Dei, that God doesn't need the church, that God is always involved in his creation, in God's creation, because that's the nature of God. God is the sustainer. God loves what God has made. So what it means to be missional is to, first of all, recognize that is God, and God is active and out there, and that God has also called us as Christians, as churches, to participate in the remaking of the world. And that's what it means to be missional. Looking at all the books and conferences and what have you, language on church websites, how many of them really match Roxburgh's definition? Not too many. And Roxburgh is essentially saying, folks, it's not about the church. Euro-tribal Protestant churches have so turned in on themselves that they presume church is the primary focus of their energy. They work on being attractional, on growing, on meeting needs and helping people, or on designing programs to send a segment of their members to serve outside their walls. Doesn't that sound like most of the churches that you know of? Certainly the ones that I've been involved in. And there are a select few maybe that God is called to leave the programming and go outside the walls of the church. We call those missionaries. But that's not certainly the calling of God upon every member of the church. It's really about the Missio Dei outside the church. It's not about the church. It's about what God is up to outside the church. They have yet to be convinced that God's primary location is out ahead of the churches and not only inside of them. So Roxburgh is not discounting the ministry of churches, the work of churches, what happens in our programming, but he is saying that, I guess to colloquialize it, paraphrase it, it's like local ministry is like a black hole. And it, even if we still believe in the beginning that God is certainly active outside of our programming and in the neighborhoods, over time, churches, ministries become black holes, and they just kind of consume their members to the point where, like, all these churches are located in neighborhoods, and they might as well just be kind of a spot of darkness. Like, people can't see the light of God in there because the churches consume so much of the resources and energy. I would say that one of the ways that I have seen God at work outside programming and the walls is out there on social media. And so it was in May of 2015 that my friend Christopher Wong and I made the decision to launch probably what was then the first ever podcast that was focused on Asian American culture makers and culture shapers, with a light dusting of spirituality and or Christianity, since I don't hide the fact that I'm a minister and and a seminary instructor. But 2/3 of my guests, since we've done this, we've had over 160 episodes. 2/3 of my guests are not self-identified Christians, and yet they know that I'm a minister. And if they still want to talk about spiritual related topics to what we were going to talk about, I'm entirely open to doing that. But certainly they don't feel any compulsion to have to discuss those things. They don't have to clean up their act or clean up their language to talk to me. I mean, to me, I feel like hospitality is for them to feel comfortable. We've had over 250,000 total listens, which, compared to the giant podcast is not a lot, but hey, there's people out there listening. We get about 7,000 around listens per month. So there's, roughly 3 or 4 episodes a month. So depending who the guest is or what's hot, what's the topic, that's always interesting. And in 2016, I worked out a partnership with the oldest ethnic theater company in America called East West Players, which obviously focuses on API stories and talent. And I worked it out that we're their corporate media sponsor. And so one of the great things is that's kind of brought me closer to the Asian American theater world. I get to have comp tickets with my wife to the premieres of all their plays, and a lot of times they're related Asian-themed plays at the Amundsen or Center Theater Group, and I get press credentials and get free tickets there too. And it's great. And my deal is I bring on some of their talent, I promote their plays, I review their plays. But talk about getting outside the programming of the church, getting way out there. I think where a lot of the pulse of the API community is, when I was heavily involved in ministry, just simply couldn't do that. Just to give you an idea, we are listened to in over 100 countries. And again, it depends on the episode. Obviously, the blue colors where we're listened to the heaviest, and so that's in North America. But all those light gray countries in Africa, South America, Europe, Asia, Scandinavia, Australia, we have listeners in all those other countries. So that's pretty amazing. Now, if you drill down just to look at the United States, we are heavily listened to in California. But we have listeners in all but one state. Doggone South Dakota. So, but I don't know that there's anyone there that might be really that interested in API people or topics, but that still kind of vexes me. And then if you break it down even further, you can see that almost half of our listeners are found in the Los Angeles area. And then there are, these major population centers where there are a lot of APIs. But anyway, it's been a great way for me to have my voice out there, me to connect with people who are not necessarily going to ever darken the doors of our church. We are called to a risky space of discerning where God is at work rather than depending on our own assessment of needs. And so, if you think about like Black Lives Matter, for instance, that's, stuff like that's going on in the headlines out there in the streets. Most of the time, most Asian American pulpits and churches are absolutely silent, not saying anything about what's going on. Or more recently, the separation of young children from their families of undocumented immigrants at our southern border. I mean, again, you just don't hear that, and so I think we're seeing that this is a time in history where, starting with the millennials, I mean they just have no time for pastors, leaders, churches that just seem to be oblivious or avoiding getting involved and daring to see what's God up to and what is God calling us to. Perhaps most painfully, a commitment to God's agency requires us to lay down our need to know ahead of time what this will mean for church forms and structures. So talk about building a bridge as you walk on it, right? If anything, churches will have to be willing to lay down control and go with Jesus into the local before they can faithfully discern what remaking the church will involve today. And I think this is a big sticking point because a lot of times, churches are existing in form. And so they're saying, well, so does it mean we're not going to ever meet, or we're not going to meet at our normal time? We're not going to have a Wednesday night Bible study. People are trying to parse out the specifics of what changes this is going to bring about and whether I'm going to be happy with it or not. And what Roxburgh is arguing is you can't start with the form of the church. The form of the church needs to respond to the Missio Dei. So participating in the mission of God, according to Roxburgh, has to come prior to knowing what the church will be. And just that assertion is going to drive so many churches and church leaders crazy. Certainly, I think established churches and Asian immigrant churches, Asian American churches, I think new church plants may have more potential just because they don't have all this baggage and history. But even so, I still think people are already assuming that they know the form of church, even if they're trying to be missional. What the church does is discern how and where it's called to participate with God in the world. Participation with God reframes agency from the church back to God. The church comes to know its concrete identity through the act of discerning and participating, not the other way around. So, maybe to use my podcast as an example, I got out there, I found an audience, I found out the issues that matter to many people in the API community, and it's like as I get to know them, as I built up some credibility, respectability, if there were to be any kind of church that grew out of the podcast, it would have to be based on the experience of building this network and finding out what these issues are, instead of saying, okay, now that I've met all these people through the podcast, or I have all these listeners, now that I just invite them to church as usual. I mean, that is not what Roxburgh is talking about here. So what is the church's vocation? What does it look like for us to go on a journey together in discerning what the Spirit is up to ahead of us in our neighborhoods? Roxburgh would argue the church's vocation is to get out there, look for God, figure out what God is up to, and then join God. And that is going to determine a church's vocation. Now, in order to determine this, he talks about engaging in certain practices. And you can read more about this in the book, but it starts with listening. Go out there, shut up. Do less talking, do lots more listening. Listen to the community leaders, listen to the people in pain, listen. And then as you've been listening for a while, especially with some from the church too, begin to discern. I'm sure, we hear lots of things. So what is God saying amidst all of what we're hearing? And then here it is, risk making mistakes, but start experimenting. Like, what would it look to partner with God in what God is already doing out here in the neighborhoods? And then having sufficient experiences, take some time individually and certainly as a ministry group to reflect. It's like, what have we been learning? What mistakes have we made that we shouldn't make again? What did we think were mistakes that now we see are actually something quite fruitful? And then finally, deciding what form the ministry is going to take, or the church is going to take, in light of all these practices. So you can see you end up asking very different kind of questions when you really have a missional mindset. The typical mindset is, how do we fix the church and make it work again? How do we get the young people back? How do we keep people from leaving and more people coming? That's very church-centric. It's not very missional. Whereas the missional question would be, how do we go on a journey together, discerning what God is up to ahead of us in our neighborhoods in order to join with God there? So very open-ended, And it's not presuming that the church has to exist or has to exist in a certain form. Several years ago, I led the church through very much kind of a Roxburghian time of discernment. And it had to do, I had mentioned earlier how in January 2007 in a dream, I felt like God called me to spend down my reputation on an then unnamed group of people that could only take away from my reputation. And several months later, it became obvious to me that it was API LGBTQ Christians who were homeless, spiritually homeless. And so I went on the journey first, and as you'll learn about the hero's journey and deep change and all of that, one has to go through your own personal transformation and journey before you can really understand what you're inviting other people to. So I went on this journey, and in the first couple of years, I actually went outside my comfort zone, outside the church circles, and got to know and work with some secular API LGBTQ people. But I also became a little bit more safe, and I started to meet some of these spiritually homeless people that some of them had gone to Biola, some had gone to Fuller, some had gone to Wheaton, some had gone to Talbot, and they really wanted to be part of a church that still held the Bible in high regard, that was very centered on Christ, but didn't require them to lie about this aspect of themselves that they had come to make peace with or were in the process of trying to do that. And I came up with this little slogan to welcome every lost sheep home and to keep every lamb safe from harm. I think that's, in general, what every good shepherd should be about. And in this case, we went through a 1.5-year discernment process. Once sufficient numbers of LGBTQ API Christians started coming to the church, the natural question was, well, so what does this really mean? Talk about having to create a space to assess values, behaviors, attitudes, and habits from the past, like what goes with us, what can't. But after that discernment process, which involved the board and the entire congregation, one of the things that was determined is we are officially going to have a safe support group on Sunday mornings, twice a month. It's going to be in the bulletin. And it's not a pray the gay away thing. It's a place for the spiritually homeless to come home. And it's been quite amazing to see this group grow, and also to see the questions that have come up and been dealt with in the larger church. So anyway, that's an example. For Roxburgh, if you want to kind of pin down his approach to being missional church, is to think that it's really not about the church. If the church doesn't flourish because of our activity out there in the neighborhoods and joining God, so be it. If it never ends up taking the form of what any of us have grown up with as recognizing as a local church, so be it. But to have the opposite and to have the typical church with its programming and attractional mentality, while Rome is burning, while the world is in dire need and God is out there trying to remake that world, for us not to join God in that, to not be part of the Missio Dei, Roxburgh is saying is completely missing the point of what it means to be Christians, certainly what it means to be the church.